which is Know Your Rights. And I want to introduce my amazing friend and speaker, JOSIE MOBERG, who is a lawyer and a public defender from Oregon, and he's going to be giving you a lot of important information of how to know your rights. So give it applause to her.
And I'm Nida, because I've got this cool Britney Spears moment happening. Hey y'all, let me know if I'm ever talking too quiet. We're gonna have a pretty substantial Q&A section at the end, so unless it's really important for you to understand something I'm talking about, I would appreciate it if we could save our questions for then. Michelle talked a little bit about me, but I wanted to give the background of where I got my information from, just so y'all are understanding kind of the limitations of what I know. It's really hard to give broad kind of summaries of what our legal rights are. And so, you know, take everything with a grain of salt. But I'm currently a public defender in Oregon. I'm actually going to be transitioning into immigration law soon. But I've been on the board of the National Lawyers Guild Portland chapter for a few years. I've personally been arrested for activism. I've been a police liaison. I've done a lot of different kind of legal support roles with the National Lawyers Guild, legal observing, jail support hotline, things like that, and we'll get into what those mean later. I used to be the lead of the DXC's legal team. That's like the coolest thing I've done. But I passed the torch over to Tor, who's been doing an incredible job for over a year now. All of my experience really is Oregon specific, so you know, that's just one of the limitations here. And then generally, I have lots of clients of my own, so I can't be giving legal advice to other folks while I have my own clients. If you have specific questions about something, it is really good to just like find a lawyer to talk to you specifically, because you know, the things that I'm talking about today are going to be really general themes and suggestions and things to keep in mind. Everybody has their own legal positionality within this country, within the state, within the city, and so it's really important not to take what I'm talking about here as like the end of the conversation. This is the stuff that we're gonna be talking about today. We've got about an hour together before I'm gonna switch over to Q&A. We're going to start off with the US Constitution and what it actually allegedly guarantees for you in terms of your constitutional rights, some advice on how to interact with police officers in different kinds of situations. We'll take a little break and then talk about kind of the life cycle of a criminal case, what the kinds of charges are that we see for activists, and then kind of some tips, I guess, in terms of planning a protest and how to show up on a day of a protest, especially in terms of legal support. So the biggest qualifier that I like to give when I do Know Your Rights trainings is that you can know your rights, but you also have to know your reality. The best function of knowing your rights, in my mind, is to be able to minimize the amount of time you have to talk with a police officer. That's like kind of the main goal, is to not have a lot of interaction with the cops. The sad news is that knowing your rights is not going to stop the police from violating your rights. So, you know, this is going to help reduce the interaction, reduce the risk of an arrest, reduce the risk of a conviction, you know, help your lawyer out in getting the case thrown out, and then reduce the sentence, reduce what you actually end up getting punished with. If you either are convicted at trial or you take a plea deal or whatever. So that's kind of the function of knowing your rights, and I know that like is way less cool than being like, I know my rights so that they never get violated, but it is what it is. The other thing I like to say at the outset of these kinds of trainings is just that, you know, direct action, activism, taking kind of legal risks potentially in your organizing work, that's like a really powerful tool. If you look at history, like this is a big threat to power when people are out there in the streets, risking arrest, doing things just like open rescue, but also just doing marches and things like that. So I like to be honest about the fact that that is a risk, and it's more of a risk for some people than others. The types of things that can be impacted by a conviction. I mean, I listed them up there: future employment, enrollment at schools. Some campuses, especially recently, have been kind of reworking their student body contracts, and so, you know, it's worth looking into your school if you think that there might be kind of risks there. It can impact whether or not you qualify for kinds of government assistance. It can impact your right to vote once we get up into felony charges. And then, of course, in my mind, the most important one, your bodily liberty and safety. The police are extremely violent. They have very, very dangerous weapons that they use very freely. Again, obviously, white people, able-bodied people, cisgender people are going to be at less risk in terms of bodily liberty and safety. That's really important to be honest about and to keep in mind as we're going through talking about what we are wanting to do in the actions that we do and who should be in what roles. White people, like, you don't make those decisions. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what I think the most useful parts of the Constitution are. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the US Constitution. That's what us criminal defense attorneys find the most useful. That's the stuff that we use over and over again to get evidence thrown out, cases dismissed. But I'm not trying to be like, the Bill of Rights are amazing, right? Because, like, the people who wrote those fucking suck, and they're also hundreds of years old, so I'm not trying to be like, look at these Bill of Rights and like how perfect. James Madison is the main one who wrote them. He owned people, he stole millions of acres of land in the name of assimilation. So we're using them today, but by no means are we like adopting like a support for everything about them. These are the most important ones that we use on a daily basis as criminal defense attorneys. I think specifically for activists, you know, I think the First Amendment is super, super important. We're seeing new carve-outs by the Supreme Court of the First Amendment right to free speech, and that's really scary, but these are allegedly what you guys have, right? In practice, there's, you know, hundreds of years of case law that limit and carve out these promises, but you know, right to free speech, right to assemble, right against unreasonable searches and seizures, right to remain silent, right to due process if you're going to be incarcerated, right to a lawyer, and to a speedy public trial. I just have to say this because it's such a huge thing in Oregon right now. There are people going a year charged with a crime who have still not gotten a public defender even though they qualify for one, because we just don't have enough lawyers. So, you know, these are very, very violated every single day. This is just a little kind of acronym to help folks when you want to be invoking your rights with a police officer. I would love suggestions if you have a better way of making this make sense, but A for attorney, I want my lawyer. That should always be the first thing that you say if you have to say something to a police officer. Body and belongings, kind of like them trying to engage with you physically. Even if you can't prevent a search or a frisk, we'll get into that in a minute, but even if you can't do that, you should still say the words, I do not consent to any searches. So you're not like resisting, you're not saying, no, I won't do it, but you're just standing there and you're saying, I don't consent to searches. They probably have body cam on, and if they don't have the legal justification to force you to consent to a search, they can pretend that you were agreeing voluntarily if you don't say those words. So that's why we include that one. And then C, conversation over, communication done. I want to remain silent past that. So I'm going to be going through some different kinds of interactions that you could have with police officers when you're engaging in activism of a variety of kinds. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just kind of some things to keep in mind. The first thing we're going to talk about is when, like today, we're out in public, we're on a sidewalk, we're somewhere we're allowed to be, someplace that's public property, and a police officer approaches you and tries to talk to you. The basic rule is that you do not have to interact with the police. If the officer is just trying to like get something from you and they have no reason to actually be stopping you, just keep moving, don't engage with them. If they're like, hey, cool sneakers, you just like keep walking. It's not necessary that you say thank you. If the officer seems like they're really singling you out for some reason, then we get into our next category, which is they might be trying to detain you. The basic rule here is that police need reasonable suspicion that you are currently or very recently engaged in criminal activity in order to detain you. So at that point, you can ask them, are you detaining me? If they say yes and you think, no way did I do anything wrong, you can ask them why, and then they might say, no, I just wanted to talk to you. So, that's kind of one exception of don't talk to cops, is if you're not sure. You're not sure if they're detaining you or not. You're not sure why they are, if they say they are. If they say you're not being detained, go back to step one, walk away. You do not have an obligation to engage with them. If they say you were speeding or, some other kind of traffic ticket or something like that, you might have to give them your ID so that they can give you a ticket. But generally speaking, keep going, don't engage with them. If they say that they are detaining you, then there are a couple things that change. First of all, they can require that you produce ID at that point. That's one of the reasons why it can be helpful to have ID on you when you go to a protest. We'll get into that more later. But then the other big thing that changes is that they can do what's called a pat-down frisk. This is from the case US v. Terry. That's why it's called the Terry stop. It's very racist origins of this case law. Basically, they're allowed to do kind of like a loose pat down of your outer layer of clothing if they have a reason to believe that you're currently armed and dangerous. Of course, the police have their own things that make them scared, that are usually wrong and messed up. But that is technically the rule, that they have to have like a real reason that they think that you're armed and that you could be hurting someone. If that happens, if you're being detained, if they say that you can't walk away, you're being detained, then you should stay put, invoke your rights like we practiced before, ABC, lawyer, I don't consent to searches, I want to remain silent. If they make you produce your ID, you should do it. And then if they don't let you go at that point, right, because eventually when they're detaining you, they have to either let you go or develop probable cause to arrest you. So unfortunately, if you get arrested, that's the biggest bummer. Police do need probable cause to arrest you. That is a little bit complicated to define. It's a lot of case law defining what that means. It's more than just reasonable suspicion though, right? Because that's what they need to detain you. So to actually arrest you, they have to think, totality of circumstances, you probably did commit this crime. Like there's a clear evidence that you committed this crime. And it has to be a specific crime. They can't just say, you look like a criminal. They have to say, I think that you stole this, or I think that you trespassed, or I think that you, hurt someone. Again, if that's happening, if they say you're under arrest, stay put, invoke your rights. Do not resist arrest. That's its own crime. I have a lot of clients who only have resist arrest as their entire criminal history, and it's just something that if the police ever are looking your name up and they see that on your criminal history, they do treat people differently. So, obviously make your own decisions, but my advice would be not to resist the arrest. So sometimes they, arrest people, put you in cuffs, transport you to jail, either to be booked or to be held. Sometimes though, what we see a lot in activist arrests is that they'll just give you a citation. They'll give you a criminal citation that says you're being charged with a crime, and it'll have your arraignment date on it that you have to show up in court for to get officially charged by the court. But if you are getting transported and booked to the jail, the basic rule is that jail sucks. You should ask for your phone call. You do have the right to a phone call. Be really, really careful who you call. I have a lot of clients that just called their bestie and were like, dude, so this is what happened. Blah, blah, blah. and that is recorded, and then I get that audio file before trial, and it's not something your lawyer will be happy that you said. So, you know, ask for your phone call. If you know your lawyer's phone number, that's phenomenal, that's protected conversation at that point, privileged and confidential. But, you know, just kind of be mindful in general. Even not on the phone, jails have eyes on all the walls. They have recording devices, cameras, undercover arrestees even. If you don't know someone super, super well, maybe don't even talk to them at all, even with niceties. And then if you have needs that are being met, this is like a really hard one for me to talk about just because people have really, really traumatizing things happen to them in jails. I've had clients who are trans who got put in the wrong facility. I've had clients who need medications who haven't gotten them. I've had clients who, you know, needed to be able to have their phone call because their dog was at home and no one to take care of their dog and they were getting denied their phone call. So, you know, be as squeaky of a wheel as you can, be squeaky in writing if you can, ask for a kite, send out, you know, like a little written document that says, I'm making these requests. And then if you can, get that phone call and talk to jail support or a friend on the outside. Having folks who are outside of the jail call into the jail with those demands, it like increases the likelihood that they will listen tenfold. So that's another reason why having a good, strong community of support is super important. I want to talk about bail super fast just because I didn't even really know what bail was before I became a lawyer, and I had been arrested, so that should tell you a lot about how smart I am. Bail is basically insurance. It's basically your promise to the court that you're going to show up at your next court hearing, that you're not going to be in the wind, as we call it, for years and just never having accountability for what you did. Usually you only have to pay 10%, so you know, if your bail's $200, you give them $20, you get out. If you don't show up, theoretically they could charge you the rest of that, the $180 that you didn't pay. Every facility has a different system of how you can post bail. Usually I include like, call this number, blah, blah, blah. But that's because I usually do know your rights trainings in a specific county, so I know how it works there. It's always a good idea to look up what the nearest facility, detention center, etc. is to the action that's taking place if you're organizing the event. Just to know, you know, where you would go, where people would be transported, how you would post their bail, things like that. In Multnomah County, where I live, there's like on the phone, there's online, there's at the jail. It's like they make it pretty easy, but that's not always the case. And then huge plug for all defense funds and bail funds. We love you. There are different ones in different places. In Portland, we have a really great one called Defense Fund PDX. They have a Venmo. I've had so many clients who are like 19 years old on a trespass case, or, you know, held on such a small amount of bail, but they don't have that amount of money to get out. And the Defense Fund has gotten them out of jail. So they save lives, and they're good to organize, and they're also good to donate to if anyone happens to know rich people, which I kind of doubt that we do. I wanted to put a little stretch break in here. I always get really like sleepy and kind of glossy when I am listening to talks, so if anybody wants to stand up, no requirement, and just do like a little bit of a stretch, I feel like that would be good for me. I also put this in here so I could drink water, because I always know I forget. Okay. All right. As people wrap up with our little stretches, the next thing is actually one of the more important things. I put these screenshots up here. I'll wait for folks to kind of settle back down. I put these screenshots up here. I'm not sure if there is a California equivalent. I totally should have done that in hindsight, but Oregon is great because you can look up all the laws online for free, publicly accessible. I would guess that California has that. But I put kind of examples of the different severities of charges that we see brought against activists in Portland. The first kind is technically not a criminal charge, but it's in the same system, so I'm including it. This is tickets, right? So they can't send you to jail for a ticket. I mean, contempt and things we'll get into later, but generally speaking, you can get a violation. We know people get violations for speeding and for parking in the wrong place. These are not any different than that, but they just kind of, look a little bit different in how we get targeted as activists for things that they wouldn't ticket somebody for having graffiti if they were working for Chevron and they had some, right? But if somebody is an animal rights activist on a march and you have a spray paint can, even if they don't see you use it, they can give you a ticket if they think that you're going to be using it. And again, these are just tickets. These are not actual criminal charges, so they're less scary, but they're still important to know about. And I should also qualify this by saying, for each one of these, I'm going to give an example. I'm giving the stupidest example that I can find, right? I'm giving you the example of that's something that they can be mad about, just to kind of show how fake the law is and how dumb it is. So generally speaking, this is the world I operate in. I'm in the misdemeanor unit in Portland. And so misdemeanor crimes are the lowest level crimes in this country. The maximum sentence in Oregon for a misdemeanor is a year, 364 days in jail. Functionally, that's very, very, very rare, if not completely out of question. But, depending on the misdemeanor, driving under the influence, for example, in Portland, people can get jail time. People can get weeks of jail time for sure. So I included criminal trespass as an example here. The different levels of criminal trespass make it a more serious misdemeanor, basically make it a more risky sentence. So a Class C misdemeanor, the ceiling of the jail time is 30 days. A Class A misdemeanor, the ceiling is that year. And in Oregon, you can always go online and look up what these crimes are and read exactly what they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. With trespass, it depends on the type, on the degree of the trespass, but criminal trespass in the second degree, the lower levels of trespass, they kind of just have to prove that you knew that you weren't allowed on that property, that you knew it was private property, that you knew that you didn't have a reason to believe you had a right to be on that property, and that you did it anyway. Felonies are the worst ones. The maximum sentence is state-specific. I have not personally, I've never tried a felony case. I will say that I did get one of the worst cases from a Portland State University Palestine occupation protest dismissed because the state failed to turn over some of the body camera that the officers had, and I found out that it existed and that I hadn't gotten it, and we got an 8-count felony case dismissed for that reason. But the example that I used here, in that case it was completely ridiculous as well. My client was charged with aggravated assault of a police officer for discharging a fire extinguisher, allegedly, somewhere near officers. And they were like, oh, that's nice. So it's fun to be a lawyer because you see how babies the cops are. But, in here, this is the elements of felony riot. You're in a group of 5 to 6 people. You're engaged in tumultuous or violent conduct. What does that mean? Your guess is as good as mine. And that there is a risk of public alarm. That just doesn't feel like that should be a real thing that they can say is a crime. Another thing that I think is really important to talk about is the civil liability of activists. I think that before I went to law school, I didn't understand the difference between criminal and civil. Criminal is when something that you do is a harm to the state, to the community at large. charge. Civil is suing someone, right? It says, you hurt me as an individual here. You're not saying, hey, me as the state of Oregon needs to punish you for this thing. You're saying, hey, you owe me money because you did something to me. So, you know, if you are hypothetically charged with criminal mischief for having damaged someone's property, damaging the property of a farm, for example, not only could you have that criminal charge, but then the farm could sue you as well. So you kind of have to think about the different layers of risk with different kinds of actions so that you can prepare and protect yourself the best. There's a lot of different ways that a criminal case can resolve. My favorite is, well, no, they don't go in order, but my favorite way is no complaint. That means that at the date of your arraignment, the district attorney stands up and says, I am about to read a list of what are called no complaints. If your name is on this list, that means that the state is not currently pursuing charges against you. And then the case goes away. So theoretically, they could bring that charge back sometime within the statute of limitations. But that's the easiest one for your lawyer because they never even get appointed to your case. The second one is dismissal. That one does usually take a little work. Whether that's having a motion to suppress evidence hearing where you get the gun suppressed, right? That's an example of a case that I had where the officer did not have the requisite exigent circumstances to search my client's vehicle. It was an extremely clearly racially motivated traffic stop, and we got the gun itself suppressed as a fruit of the poisonous tree. And so then the case had to be dismissed because they just didn't have any evidence that of a crime with a gun. And then trial, right? That's the one that we all know of. That's actually relatively uncommon. If you make it all the way to trial, there's usually a reason. Either the state is like, oof, we got them. We have so much on them that we're only going to offer them a plea deal with so much jail time that you might as well take it to a jury. Or oftentimes in activist cases, then, trial is kind of the point some of the time, right? Like that's the public moment. That's the time for you to tell your story. I'm really, really pro-trial. I think that they're really, really powerful, even when it's not an activist case. I think, I'm a public defender, so all of my clients are very low income. The vast majority of my clients, I think, have a story that's important for the community to hear. The vast majority of my clients should not have been arrested, do not, in any conceivable world belong in jail. So I'll give one example of a trial that I won a couple months ago at this point. The jury saw body cam of my client maybe kicking officers and maybe screaming, someone come barbecue these pigs, which I know we don't agree with that language, but it's still kind of iconic. And we won that trial, right? And it was a resisting arrest case, and they were like, not guilty. And the judge's clerk actually gasped audibly on the WebEx, and she was like, disconnect the WebEx, someone's on the WebEx. They were like, what, not guilty? So I think trials are really great. I think that they are a really stressful thing for the person being charged with the crime, right? Because there's so much uncertainty. But I generally really love juries. If you have a lawyer who's going to take the time to, really ask good questions during voir dire, that's when you get to ask questions of the prospective jurors. I think trial is usually a really good route. But if that, for whatever reason, is too scary for a client, then negotiating really good plea deals for probation. Maybe I've had the lowest probation I think I got was 30 days, and he had to do 5 hours of community service, and it actually got the charge dismissed. So he didn't even end up with a conviction for that one. So plea deals can be a better option for certain people. My favorite way, if you aren't going to get no complaint dismissal or a trial win, to resolve a case is a civil compromise. So this is something that I know that they have in California, we have it in Oregon. I think it's the closest thing to restorative justice that exists. It's basically outside of the criminal system, resolving with the named victim in the case, doing something that makes them feel better, and then the state can't proceed. So It's state specific. In Oregon, basically as long as the injured party signs a contract that says, I have been made whole, they fixed my fence, they did community service, they proved that they got mental health treatment, whatever. It can literally be a letter of apology. I have gotten amazing cases dismissed with a letter of apology that would have been at least months in jail. So really, really great. You should always ask your attorney if that's an option for your charge, if you are charged with a crime. There's carve-outs, right? Obviously, something that's against the state or against a police officer, that's not gonna get civ-comped. If it's domestic violence, you're not allowed to civil compromise those charges. But it's worth looking up in the state that you live in, what that means and what's required. Okay. I want to take a little bit of time talking about what's different about those of us in this room compared to just the general population, because activist charges are super different in a lot of ways. I mean, there's also some common ground though. So all criminal cases should be defendant-led. Jail, prison, criminal convictions, all of these things are extremely, extremely serious. And we are never wanting to be in the position where we're kind of sacrificing an individual who's not consenting to being, used as this example or story or educational moment for the public. The person who's being charged with a crime should be making the decisions, and that's always true, at least in my book. So I always have my first meeting with clients be what I'm saying hardly anything. I want them to tell me what their goals are in their life, what they want to accomplish a decade from now. I want to know what they're most scared of happening today, what they're most scared of happening in the next few months, what they're willing to do. I've had clients who are like, I could fundraise $2,000 to get this little trespass case civil compromised. And I've had clients who, really can't even get community service, who are just I am making, the decisions out of desperation. I have no wiggle room. You could put me in jail, but I can't do much else if I'm on the outside. The goals, I think, that all criminal cases have in common are to get a not guilty verdict, even when we're wanting to go to trial and get things publicized. Not guilty is sure a hell of a lot better than guilty. So, minimizing the risk of a conviction is always a good thing. There's a lot of different kinds of defenses, affirmative defenses. There's jury nullification, which basically means the jury thinks that technically they did the crime, but who cares? Which I gave an example of that just a second ago. Defense of others, necessity defense. There's all these different kinds of defenses. It's state specific, so you should look it up. But that's kind of the first goal, is to get a not guilty verdict. And then another goal for all criminal cases is to convince the judge, right? So the jury decides whether or not you're guilty. Usually you get the right to a jury to decide whether or not you're guilty. You don't have to have a jury. You can do a bench trial where the judge decides guilty, not guilty. But even if the jury decides guilty, not guilty, if you are convicted, the judge is the one who sentences you. So the jury doesn't get to decide how long you go to jail, how much you have to pay, any of that, whether or not you go on probation. That's all up to the judge. So when you're doing a trial, you really are communicating both to the jury and to the judge. It's important to have kind of that backstop sympathy with the judge, so that even if the jury convicts you, the judge is gonna say, okay, well, yeah, they said you're guilty, but come on, we heard this story. So, sentence of discharge is no sentence. That's probably impossible in a trial, but you could get a very low probation sentence with no active requirements of you, so that just means stay out of trouble for a few months. The way you get the lowest sentence possible is by telling the story of the defendant, telling the story of the person who was charged, building empathy for that person, make it feel like, would I have really done something different if I was in their shoes as the judge? And then political cases are unique. They have certain things that are not necessarily true for the vast majority of people charged with crimes. The main two I put up here, you can plan before you get arrested, what you're gonna do, and you can talk to a lawyer about what might be helpful. You can collect evidence, you can collect footage, you can build up, for example, that defense of others, or necessity defense, or jury nullification. You can get all of this stuff, and again, if you talk to a lawyer, you can figure out what would actually be admissible, because not everything that you would imagine would be actually can come in at trial. But you can do all of this stuff at the front end before you even end up arrested. That can really, really help you in an activist kind of intentional arrest situation. And then there's other goals of political trials too. I mean, Zoe is an incredible example of that, right? Like, oh my God. Telling the animal story, telling not only the animals that maybe were rescued or photographed or whatever, but kind of like a broader platform for public education about what it is that we're out here talking about. Making a little bit of a spectacle in a trial is usually not something that we would do, but in an activist trial, I think that that becomes a lot more relevant and a lot more useful. And then a big goal of political cases is to establish like very bold new precedent. In general, as criminal defense attorneys, if our goal of going to trial is to establish a bold new precedent, that's not a position that we want to be in for our client. It's really, really hard, you know, to get a jury to create such a leap of precedent that, you know, I mean, I think it's so important that we have those happen in activist trials, but that's just not something that we can be aiming for in an average criminal trial. A couple little notes about organizing a protest. Hopefully everybody in this room is like, you know, fire lit in your belly. You're ready to take a little bit more of a step to imperfectly try organizing more actively yourself. So one thing that was really hard for me when I started organizing for the first time is this idea of confidentiality, because I just love to talk. I'm like a big blabber, and I also really hate feeling like I'm gatekeeping information. I really hate to feel like I'm purposefully keeping somebody like out of the know, because that just feels douchey. But that's like not what you're doing when you're not telling somebody information that they don't need to know. You're not gatekeeping at all. You're actually doing them a favor. And for example, me, please don't tell me any of the things that you know or are planning unless I ask for that information. If I get subpoenaed later on and you wanted to share all these confidential details with me, I have to make a really hard decision for myself. I have to decide whether I'm going to lie under oath and say I don't have information when I do. That has real consequences, and for me specifically, I could get disbarred if they can prove that I'm lying under oath. Or I have to snitch. I have to say, oh yes, they told me this, and like, I don't want to do that. So, definitely don't put people in a position that they don't need to be in. You're not being rude. I know these are like the things that we want to talk about the most because they're the coolest. But there are people that you can talk to them about, right? Like, you're a lawyer. And anyone else who is there with you who like actually participated and like already knows that information. Like, you guys will become absolute besties because you're the only people who can know those things. Careful communication is really important too. I think a lot of us think about this just in terms of like, oh, we use Signal so that we don't like, get arrested later for stuff. It's actually both. It's both preventing like sabotage of the action and making it safer after the action for people to minimize risk of arrest and stuff. If you are out here just like on Google being like, gigantic open rescue tomorrow, like that can also just mean that when you get there tomorrow, there's police cars and you don't rescue those animals. So, there's a lot of reasons why being a little bit careful with information is important. I put some of the apps up here for like an equivalent to the Google Suite, because I think those are kind of the main things that people use. For messaging, Signal, for Zoom equivalent, Jitsi, for Google Docs equivalent, CryptPad, for Gmail equivalent, ProtonMail. And again, as with everything, I would love suggestions of adding to these lists. I wanted to put a little thing up here about infighting. I know that it's something we talk about all the time, and I don't want to seem condescending at all, but I think a lot of times when we talk about infighting, we don't actually talk about what that looks like in practice, so then it can sneak up on you, right? We can be complicit in fostering an environment of, infighting when we don't even realize that it's happening. So I wanted to talk about kind of the warning signs of how we might be creating that culture. Respecting a diversity of tactics is kind of 101. There are gonna be people who are gonna be out there handing out leaflets saying, let's go vegan, who are we should never steal property, right? And that's fine. If they don't wanna be doing that, great. We don't even need to spend the time critiquing that approach, right? Because we have bigger things to worry about. That's not worth our breath. Respecting a diversity of tactics is also important because even though we think we are totally right, I am always right, by the way, other people are gonna be receptive to different kinds of arguments. And when you're shutting down different approaches to things, you're actually shutting down other lights that would have gone off as a result of those other approaches. So it's really, really hard to hold that, as you're watching somebody do something that you really wouldn't yourself do. But it's super important to just it's not worth it, and move forward. And then assume good intentions. That means that when somebody does something that you don't think is good, you go up to them and you're like, hey, Josie, you said something during that talk that actually was offensive, and you seem like somebody who wouldn't want to do that. So let me tell you this information I have about why that was, harmful or offensive. And I will immediately, as will most people, say thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I didn't know. And especially if you do it in a way that does assume that they do have good intentions. That's a really hard thing to do when you hear somebody say something that is offensive, when you see someone do something that you think is really messed up. Really, really hard to go to that person and not go to your friend and say, this person did this, isn't that dumb? But that's the moment, right? That's the moment when infighting is about to happen. And that's the time that it's so important to take that discomfort and go to that person and say, I'm really uncomfortable, but I know I need to do this, so I'm gonna just say it. And I promise it's always gonna end better. And then the last one, don't put people at a risk that they didn't consent to. I think that's really, really easy to be obviously. But then you're out there on the street and people have this great idea to go and spontaneously do a thing that is way more illegal than what you had all decided to do together. Pause for a moment. That would be maybe super badass. But maybe there's people who are in the vicinity who are gonna be at a way higher risk than you are. So being really careful that you're not, imposing your own more loose boundaries on the people that are around you. Packing for a protest, ask a lawyer, packing for a protest section, because I say that because everybody, you decide your life, you do you. But these are just things I would think about. Having your ID on you can be really helpful, especially if you're intentionally getting arrested. I think having your ID on you is very good. Have meds on you, but also maybe separate half and half, have at home, half with you. Sometimes they can confiscate them, and then if you're released, you're well, now I'm outside of the jail, but all my stuff is in there. Obviously food, water, shoes, blah, blah, blah. I say that, but I'm mostly saying that for myself because I'm the bitch who always forgets to do those things. Maybe don't bring stuff that's illegal if you're intentionally getting arrested. I mean, again, do you. If you want to have your manifesto on you. It's iconic, but it's really not a good idea. Maybe don't have weapons, although I have seen a pillow be classified as a weapon, so, don't overdo it. Sensitive information, maybe don't have the whole plan of everything for that day there. If you're gonna bring your phone, please don't have that Face ID stuff or the fingerprint ID stuff. Cops are assholes, they will totally do whatever to hurt you. I think it's a really good idea. I think it's probably safe to say most people think a buddy system is good if you're gonna be out there at a protest. I think it's a good idea to huddle up with your buddies beforehand. This is another one of those things that like doesn't feel comfortable to do, and it kind of maybe feels a little nerdy or like losery to be like, okay guys though, but like what's the plan? Like what are we gonna, like I wanna know everything. Like that feels like you're kind of like a loser, but like it's so important. And once you are in the habit of doing it, it actually makes you feel like you're in way more control. It makes the action way more successful. Talk about time commitment, like who has to be somewhere at X time. Talk about how much risk you're gonna be putting yourselves and the group at. Talk about a meetup spot if you get separated. And then acknowledge the different levels of risk. Back in 2020, in Portland, I don't know how many people are familiar with what Portland looked like in the summer of 2020. I still have clothes that I can't get the tear gas off of. There were, in our friend group, probably 90% of us were people of color who were either, very low income or had immigration vulnerabilities. And it ended up being so important for us to have that conversation before we would, go into the den each night. Because different people wanted different things. They wanted those of us who were white and better off financially to do different things. And it's not always obvious, right? Some people want a white friend to stand between them and the cops. Some people fucking don't want you to take their spot in the group. Like, you need to talk about it because you can't end up just guessing. That's always going to be putting the entire group at a much bigger risk, and specifically those who are already at a much bigger risk. So just acknowledge it. Just say like, okay, cool. I'm like totally less likely, especially as like a femme person who's like bubbly and like a lawyer, to be at like a risk of injury and violence from the police. And like, that is just true. And it doesn't become less true because we don't talk about it. It just becomes less, useful and like advantageous and strategic to not talk about it. And why would we give them any more advantages than they already have? I wanted to super fast talk about the kinds of legal support roles. There's so many, and these are probably very imperfect definitions, but these are some of the ones that I have done myself. Police liaisons, as we saw today, that's not always a role that you need at a protest, but I think oftentimes it is. These are not people whose job it is to mediate or, negotiate or whatever. The main function is to de-escalate and stall them. So the example I use is from my own experience as a police liaison. The most effective thing I found was not to be giving them legal jargon. It wasn't being very strict with them and like firm with them and confident. It was actually to be like a very ditzy, like I felt so misogynistic because the thing that worked the best was for me to just like look really dumb and incompetent and like girly and like dainty and like be like, I'm so sorry, I know that we have to go over here and I'll be right back. And it like, that was the thing that like made them not arrest people for enough hours for us to get the thing done. So, police liaisons don't have to be people who are lawyers. That can really just be anyone who feels comfortable physically, safe enough physically to stall them. And then legal observers, I'm not sure, can I just, curiosity's sake, raise your hand if you know what a legal observer is. Okay, cool. So legal observers are people who go to protests. They're easily identifiable by the activists themselves. So at the National Lawyers Guild, we wear these bright lime green hats that say National Lawyers Guild Legal Observer on them. These are people who collect data on the police's crimes, for lack of a better word. These are people who will write down the jail support hotline number on activists, if there is one. These are people who basically are there to, get everything that we can ready for the lawyers. Get it so that they can be calling someone when they're arrested. Get it so that they can be, the police doing something that they were not allowed to do. That's now on video. That's sent to their lawyer. Their lawyer walks up and says, boom, and then the case gets dismissed. Legal observers should not be filming you, generally. Like if you're just like hanging out, police aren't even there, and a legal service going around filming you like take their hat away. That's not their job. They might film an arrest as it's actually happening if it seems like the arrest itself is, unlawful. They might be filming that. Usually, best practice is to ask the person if they can who's being arrested if that's okay. But generally, their job is to be filming the police, to be documenting the different officers' badge numbers who are present, documenting when the warnings are given to disperse so that the police can't lie and say that there had been like 10, things like that. And then jail support. Oh my gosh, love you all who do jail support. There's different kinds of jail support, like kind of mechanisms. You can have forms where people kind of fill out important information, their gender, if they're trans, making sure that they end up in the right facility. Right facility sounds gross, but you know what I mean. People who have immigration vulnerabilities, people who are youth, they'll have their parents called, just kind of collecting the information that allows the organizing team to know what your level of risk is in the jail. And then emergency contacts, things like that, so that if you call jail support when you get arrested, they know who to call for you. Jail support forms should not just be like in a pile. I have seen so many different actions where I'm like, what are these for? Oh my gosh, this is someone's full legal name and like their documentation status. Like whoever's in charge of jail support, like do better, like forms, because those are really, really important to be protecting with your life. You should delete them or shred them or burn them after immediately. The jail support hotline, I talked about this before. This can be either like a DIY Google number or something, or like, hey, y'all, Josie's cell phone tonight is the jail support hotline. But it's the number that people who are arrested as part of a specific action could call from jail to let people know that they are safe-ish, they're alive, and that they are in the jail. And then a jail support database. Basically, that's just something that might exist where you live. Not from our friends, but from the jail itself. They can have something in Portland, it's called inmate data, where you go online, you type in their name, and then you get to see if they are arrested, if they're in custody, what their charges are, what their bail is. So you should look online to see if there's a database, a jail database for whatever facility is relevant if you're organizing jail support. And then lastly, a legal team. So the Direct Action Everywhere legal team, shout out, little round of applause. They're doing incredible work. Not only do they organize like the criminal defense, like the lawyers for people oftentimes, but they can, help the group understand temporary restraining orders and like how far away from people's houses we have to be, and what a lawsuit means, and even this morning someone was served with a document, and they were on the legal team, so they already knew what was going to go on. And like legal teams are super important, even if you're not sure if you need one. It might be worth it just to kind of have someone whose job it is to like text me at Josie, be like, hey, what is the risk of this theft hypothetically in this state? Even if you don't have somebody who knows a ton about the law, like in the group, it's good to have somebody who's kind of thinking about those questions and like maybe asking other people. So a legal team is super important to have and super important to support. And thank you to everyone who is on the DXA legal team. I wanted to finally just share some other kind of sources of information. I'll send this slideshow. Kitty, am I allowed to do that? To share it with everyone. But there are so many different things online. These are some organizations that I personally trust, but there's just a ton of stuff online. So it's really, really good to look more into, direct action, know your right stuff, organizing 101 things. This Earth First Direct Action Manual is really fun and beautiful. But essentially this slide is just an invitation to learn more, just because it's impossible to capture like all of the information about this stuff, and it feels very scary to be like up here being like, this is legal stuff, and then think that no one will look more into any of it. And it's also really, really cool to get kind of like little groups together to do this kind of reading. A lot of these materials are super entertaining to read. Some of them give examples, some of them are just really funny or beautiful, have art in them. And so having like a little reading group that's specifically more about direct action, kind of organizing and legal rights and things like that, I think that's a really great place to start an affinity group or a reading group. But also, if you have more questions, always, you can either just come up to me or message me or text me or anything. If you're going to give me a hypothetical legal question, then it's better to do that on Signal. And again, I can't give like direct legal advice for specific situations because of what my job is right now. But I can totally help point people in the right direction. And I think that that's pretty much it. Yeah, thank you guys. We did save the last half hour for questions. I'm gonna ask Marisa to come up with me, who's currently on the DXC legal team. Little round of applause. She's not a criminal defense attorney, so if it's like questions within that realm, I'll probably be the one to answer them. But if it's kind of more broad about the DXC legal team or law in general, then I thought she would be able to provide good answers for that. I haven't been active on the DXC legal team, unfortunately, for the past year or so, and so I wanted someone up here who did, who was. So, who has questions? Someone should. I definitely did not cover everything. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that you mentioned as a way to resolve a criminal case was no complaint. Is this the way that like Petaluma Poultry is getting away with their animal cruelty?
That's a great question. So, at least as far as I know, they have not ever been charged. So if you're never charged with a crime, then there never was a crime in the eyes of the law. You don't need to get it no complainted because there never was a charging instrument or like an indictment for a felony to begin with. But certainly it would be more likely that if the state did charge Petaluma Poultry or a specific person associated with them for their animal cruelty under the California Penal Code, like the county DA might say no complaint. Yeah, that's a great question though.
So I saw you talking about resisting arrest and kind of your take on that. And I was curious to ask about just like the different aspects to resisting arrest and some differences there may be. Both one in like if an activist decides to use like some type of locking device, something that is locking them to something, as well going limp or something during arrest process versus like actually like physically like resisting the officer from doing stuff, just the differences between all those.
Yeah, really, really good question. And again, I'm speaking from Oregon specifically, so it's probably most likely different other places. There are real differences between passive resistance and active resistance. There are differences between, getting a lockbox to begin with and, just like really trying to pull away from the police. Resisting arrest, and I don't have it in front of me, so big grain of salt, but it involves some risk of injury to the police officer. So, just going limp, that's going to be really hard for the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that created a real risk of injury to the police officer. Once you get into, kicking them and saying, someone come kill them, I'm doing a jujitsu leg lock on you, which was one of my favorite quotes from a client. like, you know, the more you do, the more likely they can prove that you were creating a risk of injury of the cop beyond a reasonable doubt. The lock boxes are super interesting, and I actually don't know the case law on that. I don't know if there even is an Oregon case law on that. I can see foreseeably maybe that being resisting arrest, just because they oftentimes have to use, you know, metal cutters and things like that. And, you know, the more that the police officers have to do to get you arrested, the more that they could prove there was a risk of injury to them. Also just depends, like, who's the jury, where you live. Are you in a farming, rural, whatever community? And, like, then, I don't know. Better have a good lawyer doing voir dire, because you're gonna have a lot of people who say anything is resisting arrest when someone is on a farmer's property, right? Like, it just kind of depends. I know that's not the best answer, but I would just, you know, wherever you are, look up resist arrest, criminal code, or whatever law, and then the state, and look at what the elements of the crime. I mean, this is true for everything, by the way. You know, if you think like, oh, this hypothetical thing that we might potentially maybe do could be seen maybe as trespass. Google trespass, the state law, and it'll tell you what the statute says that crime is, because the prosecution has to prove every single part of it. They have to prove that you were actually on that land. They have to prove that you knew you weren't allowed to be there. They have to prove that you didn't leave when you were told to, right? Like, they have to prove each of those things. So it's really, really important to know what is the crime, so that you can kind of like make it either hard for them to get proof of parts of it, or make it hard for anyone to think that that constitutes the crime, if that makes sense. Do we have it? Thanks, Michelle.
So I just had a question about disorderly conduct and how cops can use that, because it's a catch-all term. And, you know, if there's 20 plus people at a bigger event, it might make more sense, but in a lot of grassroots animal rights groups, it's always like 5 people, maybe 7 people at most. And how do people kind of navigate that wording, depending on your average case of what it constitutes?
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, disorderly conduct is always the most frustrating charge, because it's like, what? Like, did we all agree as a community that, like, everyone needs to be orderly all the time? Like, what a horrible thing that I don't feel like I voted for. Yeah, I mean, it's creating risk of public annoyance or alarm in the county that I practice. I've seen people charged with that crime for, like, the stupidest things that make no sense. Most of the time, it's clients who are having maybe a tiny bit of a mental health moment, who are being a little bit louder than other folks on the street. Yeah, again, it's just like really hard to give kind of generalized advice about charges and kind of like planning or strategizing to avoid specific charges, because it depends on what the law is where you are, and kind of like how realistic it would be that they would be charging you and prosecuting you for something like that. Yeah, I don't know. Can you think of anything else?
No, I mean, I think I'd also say that the cops are going to charge you with what they want to charge you with. It depends on how much they hate you. It depends on how much they hate the message that you're spreading. And also, district attorney's offices will often, we see this all the time in our cases, charge you with stuff that ultimately they know they can't prove. Sometimes they drop some of those charges later, sometimes they don't. But I've seen charges that don't make any sense and that ultimately aren't going to stand up, and they sort of do what they want to do. So I think with something like disorderly conduct, they can kind of slap that on whatever they want. Is it ultimately going to be provable? Maybe. It's sort of like an extra, like, fuck you. In some cases, it's used that way. I think it's difficult to, many of the things that I do every day could be described as disorderly conduct, like, you know, singing on the street or just, you know, acting like a freak or whatever it is that I do.
I love that.
Could one of you tell us a bit more about the process or dynamics around the detainment process, being detained? Like, is there a length of time? Do they have the right to remove you off site? Can they take you in jail when you're only being detained, not charge. So can you talk about that whole
Totally.
step? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll have you jump in after I give a quick one, just because I feel like I actually don't know that I know the answer to that fully, which I should. When you are being detained, you have the officer has a reasonable amount of time, so unhelpful. They can't keep you there for hours and hours and hours and, interrogate you and, make you go a bunch of places like that. At that point, that's functionally an arrest, right? We think of the Miranda warnings that they have to give you when they're making an arrest, and that's not just when they're, saying you are under arrest. It's any time that they interrogate you while you're in custody functionally. And so, for example, if you have someone who's pulled over for speeding and they say, get out of the car, stand here, don't leave, what are you doing, what did you do this for, what did you do this for, okay, sit there and wait, and then, that's functionally an in-custody interrogation for the purposes of a Miranda warning. So if they said something without their Miranda warnings, that could be suppressed because it was an un-Mirandized statement while you were functionally in the state's custody. But when you're being detained, it's a little bit difficult to say what exactly the limits of that are. And again, even the limits of it that are clear in the precedent, in the case law, will be surpassed all the time. And that's why asking those questions is super important. You want to know at what point does the police officer think they're detaining you? What point does the police officer think they're arresting you? Because then you can say more clearly, you didn't have XYZ at that point that you said I was under arrest. So, that has to be suppressed. Whether that's a statement or evidence or whatever. And so, I'm trying to think of other things that are important to think about in being detained, but basically it's just an opportunity for the police officer to, check briefly if their suspicions are correct. Ask you a quick thing that will prove whether or not you were the person who just stole that car or whatever. Again, they can't do a full search of your belongings. They can't go into your things, right? They can do the pat down, frisk, outer layer of clothing, and only if they reasonably believe that you're armed and dangerous. But then if they feel something that they think is a gun, they could go in deeper to see if it is a gun. It's just kind of dependent on the circumstances beyond that point, right? I know I'm missing a stuff. Can you think of it?
I was going to say 90% of that, and the other 10%, you just taught me stuff. Thank you, Josie. As always, I think the only thing I would say is, it doesn't, whether you're being detained, whether you're not clear whether you're being detained, whether you're under arrest, no matter what stage of that process you're in, and it won't be clear, right? It's vague, and it's intentionally vague because the vagueness of it benefits the state, it benefits the police, it doesn't benefit us. No matter which one of those states you're in, which part of the process you're in, you do not have to talk to the cops. You do not have to answer any questions. You can say more than once, am I being detained? They'll ask you some more questions. Maybe they'll do a frisk or whatever. Then you say, am I being detained? Am I free to go? Am I free to go? And at some point, right, they've got to let you go if they're not going to arrest you. When that point is, I don't know. But you can ask them more than one time whether you are free to go.
Yeah, and again, asserting your rights matters so much more than just because you want to prove that you know your rights, right? Those things have very tangible legal implications. If you say, I do not consent to a search, and they did more than just that pat-down frisk, and they only had reasonable suspicion, not probable cause, and they found a bunch of cocaine or something on you, that doesn't exist in the eyes of the law at that point, because, and only because, you said clearly that you were not consenting to a search. And so, it's the reason why we tell people to invoke their rights is a lot more than just to prove that we are, educated as a community and to make the police more afraid of us, of exceeding the scope of their authority. Although that is totally another reason why doing it is cool. Because they think that people don't know this stuff. And truthfully, the police don't know this stuff. The amount of times that I have been in a motion to suppress hearing, and I'm ready, geared up with this super, super complicated legal argument, and I start cross-examining the cop, and she just admits that she didn't have a warrant or exigency. All she had was probable cause, and she busted into someone's front door. And I was like, oh, So you just had probable cause, no exigency, no warrant, no consent. And she was like, well, yeah. And I was like, and I looked at the judge, and the judge was like, because like, the cop just didn't know what she needed to enter someone's home. Like, that's absurd.
Or they'll make mistakes. Like, even cops who have been cops for a long, long time, if something stressful will happen, they'll be focused on something else and they'll arrest someone and they won't read them the Miranda rights. Somebody who's been a cop for 30 years will do that.
Yeah.
Right? So things happen all the time, and I think ideally cops' body cams are on to catch all of that. That doesn't always happen, and that's another good reason why if you're witnessing someone being arrested, if it is safe for you to do so, it's a good idea to film.
Thank you so much for giving us this training. It's great. So for us as animal rights activists, you've mentioned the state as a jurisdiction several times. But how important is it for us also to look at sort of other jurisdictions, counties, cities, special circumstance jurisdictions, that kind of thing?
Yeah, oh, such an important question. Yeah, so I mean, even just like looking federally, there are, domestic terrorism laws that apply to everybody regardless of what state you're in. There are always going to be kind of city-specific codes that are very different than what the state law is. One thing that comes to mind in Portland is that we have a gun possession charge city code version, and we have a gun possession charge state law version, and they're really, really different. The city code version has a mandatory minimum 3-day jail sentence. The state law has no mandatory minimum, and what they specifically say is a little bit different. The city code version, I believe, is the only one out of the two that requires the gun to have been loaded, but it's completely different, right? And so, in addition to looking up the state laws where you are, it's totally worth, maybe I should just do a separate training on federal law, because that's a lot to ask everybody to look up individually, but there are definitely laws like we saw, for example, in Stop Cop City and Protect the Atlanta Forest, RICO charges, racketeering charges getting brought against people. There's all these different kinds of things that can be brought by the federal government that apply to everybody, and those are oftentimes specifically targeting activists. The city code versions, I'd say, are probably more likely to be brought. We rarely, at least in Portland, this was not true in 2020, but generally speaking, don't see activists getting charged federally for their activism, but we see city code charges brought every single day. So I think it's most important that you look up the city code where you are. The county, at least as far as I know, doesn't have its own criminal law. Am I wrong? That's a silly thing for me not to know. I've never heard of a county law for criminalizing conduct. I think it's just the state law and then the city code. Okay.
I don't think city ordinances are typically criminal. You might have a violation level something at a city ordinance or a county ordinance level, but nothing important. I've never seen it.
Well, the city code in Portland is criminal. We'll look it up.
So weird. Where I'm from, it's not like that. You learn something new
but no,
every
that's
day.
really good, super important question. It does not just exist at the state level. So it's worth looking up the city that you are at, and then crimes or federal crimes for activists or something like that. There's definitely trainings online by the ACLU or NLG or Civil Liberties Defense Center that are covering kind of the things that are a risk across the states. So I'd start there for federal, and then city-wise I would just Google it. Same thing with county, even though I can't think of a Multnomah County law. I can think of specific crimes that are only crimes in Portland, Oregon, and I can think of crimes that are crimes in Oregon. I can't think of any crimes that are only crimes in Multnomah County, though. Sorry, that was a really clunky answer.
You should look it up, because we are not even on the same page about it, so you should look it up.
Yeah.
Because the jurisdictions are different.
Thank you for this forum. Given our current political state, we have a tangerine tyrant guy in office, but the question I had was, has the immigration, given our current immigration policies, have they made it harder for activists, or should activists who have immigration be a little extra careful this time?
They have absolutely eroded the protections of people who, even have lawful permanent residency. Certainly, whether or not that should change the behavior of people, that's people's choice. I have clients who are undocumented, or I have had clients who are undocumented who say that they would rather do XYZ and get sent back to wherever than not do XYZ. So I don't pretend to be able to give advice there, but I do definitely think that we are living in kind of this unknowable moment right now, certainly in terms of free speech protections. We're seeing people get deported for literally no reason, and even after the fact, after they have been deported, not getting a reason for why that was legal. And many times it is literally illegal, the reasons that they're saying that they could deport somebody who does have lawful permanent residency or some other kind of protected status. I'm not an immigration attorney yet. I haven't gotten trained up in all of that yet, so I can't really say a lot about it, but I just know that even the things that people who have been practicing immigration law for a long time thought that they knew or thought would never happen, we've seen happen. So super scary and unknowable times. And then just like kind of little tack on, we see that happening to people who are literally citizens as well. So, like we're seeing people who are citizens be denied all sorts of things that they used to be guaranteed. And so it's just like very unknowable. I think that that's a signal that the state is having to kind of tighten its grip because they know that things are getting so bad that people are going to be doing more things and pushing back more on things. But it's a really scary time, and it's honestly really hard to give people advice, even for people who know way more about immigration law than I do right now, just because even if you do try to give someone advice, like tomorrow we could have a new news story that says that that was actually really bad advice. So it's just a really scary time, and yeah, show up for each other as humans.
I was wondering, in this process, at what point do you end up in a database or something like? Is there any point at which you're just in a database from which it's hard to get out of or something like that?
Hard to get out of what? Sorry, I didn't hear.
Get out of a database that they put you in or something.
What information is captured in a database, in the jail database that I had mentioned?
Yeah, and at what point does that happen?
Oh, great question. Yes, totally. So in at least our database for the Multnomah County Detention Center, we usually see that pop up maybe 3 hours is kind of the longest I've seen. But that could be wrong. It could be taking longer for certain people. Generally speaking, it is a part of the booking process, and so jails are understaffed and whatever, so things take longer in some places and at certain times. But usually it should happen as a part of them being booked into the jail. So once their fingerprints are taken, once their mugshot is taken, once they're put into the holding cell, then they should enter, that information should be entered into the inmate data site, so jail support should have access to it pretty immediately. Whether or not that always happens, hard to promise. But yeah, I mean, the function of that is so that people can know where their loved ones are if they can't find them. So it's supposed to happen right away. And sorry, I don't know. Michelle, cut me off once we're out of time. Okay.
Over the last few years, we've seen an uptick in felony conspiracy charges for misdemeanor charges. We saw this in Wayne's case. We've seen it across socio-political movements. Can you talk about conspiracy charges and also, what they don't cover? Because I see a lot of apprehension from activists not wanting to participate in anything because they think they're going to end up with conspiracy charges.
Yeah, great question. And honestly, you probably are just as qualified to talk about that because I've never dealt with a conspiracy charge as a lawyer. I'll say just briefly that For example, in Oregon, we have, it's not like, it doesn't use the word conspiracy, but it's like a domestic terrorism type of law that just got passed by our legislature a couple of years ago. We have still yet to see that even charged. So I think a lot of the function of those laws is deterrence of activism, and then oftentimes even when people do get charged with those things, again, depending on where you are, the likelihood that a jury would actually convict somebody of something like that, you know, it depends on a lot of things, but the state knows what the likelihood of those things are, and so again, just because you're charged with something does not mean that the state is going to actually see that through to the end, right? Like there's so many things that get brought against people just to make them plead out to the lower charges. And so I definitely think so much of the law just exists to scare people into like being obedient like people and not pushing back on things. And as much as we feel comfortable doing so, like continuing to do what we think is the morally correct thing to do. Again, those of us with more privilege, more so than others, but I think so much of the function of those laws is just deterrence. I'm gonna pass it to you because I just truthfully don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in many jurisdictions, including California, the district attorney has discretion whether to charge a conspiracy crime as a misdemeanor or as a felony. So we saw this in Wayne's case. We're also seeing it in Zoe's case, where Wayne was just charged with misdemeanor trespass and then also charged with conspiracy. That could have been misdemeanor conspiracy, but instead it was charged as felony conspiracy. And the same thing is happening in Zoe's case. In my mind, it is wild to me that district attorneys are not prevented from charging felony conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor crime. But people have duked that out in court, and the situation is that they are allowed to. It's weird because with conspiracy and with aiding and abetting, which is similar but different, in ways that aren't super important to talk about here, it's a little bit vague. So I just pulled up the jury instructions. Josie was talking about reading the statute to find out what the elements of a crime are, meaning what are all the things that the prosecutor has to prove in order for a jury to be able to find that you committed this crime. Another way you can look that up is looking up jury instructions. That's the piece of paper that the jury is given with a checklist that says, is this correct? Yes. Is that correct? Yes. If any of the answer to any of these questions is no, then you have to find not guilty, right? But if you can say yes to all of them, then it's guilty. For California, if we look at conspiracy, the prosecution has to prove that you, if you're the defendant, that you intended to agree and you did agree with somebody else, right? A conspiracy requires at least two people to commit a crime, right? There's a little bit of a, do you have to know that the thing you were doing is a crime? Yes. Does the, well, I'll get to that. So you and somebody else have to agree to commit a crime, and you have to intend that one or both of you are actually going to do the crime, and either one of you or both of you has to have done what's called an overt act. And what that means is some act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Just talking is typically not an overt act. But for example, if I decided that I was going to commit a murder and I went to Josie and I said, hey, I need to murder someone. I know that you have a gun. Could I borrow your gun to murder someone? And Josie's like, of course, we're besties. Here's my murder gun. And she gives that to me, right? Now, Josie is definitely in this conspiracy, even though Josie did not agree to do any murders, but she lent me her gun, which is an overt act that helps me accomplish the murder, right? And she knows that's what I'm going to use it for. If I said to her, heaven forbid, I would never say such a thing, but if I said to Josie, I'm going to go hunting, animal hunting, which would never happen, right? And instead I used the gun to murder a human, which unfortunately only one of those things is illegal, right? Josie would not be part of that conspiracy because she thought she lent me the gun to do something that was legal. There's also aiding and abetting, which is like similar but different. The point is, if you lend your camera to someone, if someone says, hey, I need to use a camera, and you lend them your camera, and then it turns out that they use it in an open rescue that you didn't know about, you're not a conspirator. From a larger sort of scale, though, from a more bird's eye view, in our experience with open rescue cases, the people who are being prosecuted in open rescue cases are leaders of movements. Leaders of movements, leaders of actions. For example, the Reichert action, right, that Wayne was prosecuted for, he did not plan, had nothing to do with planning, and was prosecuted for it anyway because he was seen as a leader of the movement, right? And so I don't think that the government does not currently have the resources to prosecute every single person who is at a protest, or every single person who is involved in some kind of direct action or civil disobedience. People's risk tolerance, I will say, is up to them, and I wish that we could give people a really clear, idea, like this is exactly what could be prosecuted or what might be prosecuted or charged, and we can't do that. So it's really, really, really important to talk to people about their risk tolerance, especially people who, as Josie mentioned, have different risk factors. People of color, immigrants, fill in the blank, right? Anybody who has any sort of increased risk, making really sure that everybody understands what the risk tolerance is.
And I want to add just like one tiny note on that. Maria just said something about you have to know that it was a crime in order to be a conspirator. What I think is true is that you have to have known that there was going to be like the murder of a human, but ignorance of the law is not a defense, right?
Yes,
so that doesn't mean that you should try to keep your head under a rock to not know what's a crime so that you can't be, convicted of crimes. Like if that were true, wow, my job would be so much easier because none of my clients know the law. It's really better to know the law, know what's a crime than what is not a crime. What she meant was that you had to have known like what the actual thing it was going to be used for would be, and then that thing had to be a crime. You didn't have to know that murder was against the law for you to be a conspirator if I gave her my gun knowing she was going to murder a human with it.
You have to know what the thing is.
Right.
Totally, yeah. Michelle's asking us to stop. I have one more thing I want to say that just no one has said. If you are arrested in California, just if that were to happen, you have a right to vegan meals while you're in prison. People do not always know that, and so you should ask, and they may not know that you have a right to a vegan meal, so you explain to them that you have a right to vegan meals. They are not going to be nutritious or delicious, but they will be vegan.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much to Marisa and Josie. We have 8 minutes till the next and last panel, so if people want to go to the bathroom. And also, I wanted to mention that we have a table where we are trying to get people involved with the existing and solidarity. Yeah, it will be nice to have everybody together. So yeah, we can get started. I'll give people like 20 seconds to do that.
There you go.
All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you all for being here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Priya Sawhney, and I'm one of the co-founders. I'm one of the co-founders of Direct Action Everywhere, and I'm also one of the former felony defendants facing criminal charges for rescuing sick and injured animals and exposing animal abuse at California farms right here in Sonoma County, so it brings back a lot of memories. And so yeah, we have gathered here today to discuss fighting for justice in unprecedented times where we are facing repression. And for us activists, while repression is nothing new, these times are a lot more testing, and we have yeah, so it's really challenging for us change makers. And one of the things that really sticks out during this time right now is that obviously there's things happening that we have, seen happening right now that we haven't for a long time. But the powers at large are witnessing the collapse of systems that are no longer serving us. And they are taking repression to a whole new level. Whether it's forcing animal rights activists, like my friend Zoe Rosenberg, I don't know if Zoe's here. Zoe! Forcing activists like her to put an ankle monitor on and treating her like a murderer, a criminal, for simply rescuing sick chickens from a slaughter truck. Or it's Palestinian activists who are facing horrible consequences for speaking out for their people while there's a genocide happening at the hands of Israel. Or it's climate activists who are facing charges for saying a simple message, protect our planet. Or people who are fighting for the safety of their people as they're getting deported from their country. As we can see, repression is on the rise. But this incredible group of panelists are here to show us, and that's what they're going to be discussing today, and I'm going to be introducing them here in a second, that there is a path forward. And we're going to talk about that path today and talk about how to move forward in this political climate where we are facing free speech repression, fear, and a lot of uncertainty. So can I have a round of applause for our panelists? So I'm going to first start off by introducing Nida Liftawiya, who is a Palestinian activist. She's a multidisciplinary artist, a social worker, and an educator. Through her work, she dedicated to empowering communities, using art and education as a means of resistance, healing, and storytelling. And in all things, trying to capture the spirit and power of her homeland and people. So, thank you for being here, Nida. Next, I want to introduce Katie Na, a core organizer with Planet Over Profit Bay Area. Rooted in climate justice movement, her work is guided by a commitment to collective liberation and international solidarity. Thank you for being here, Katie. Next, we have Marisa Almor Menendez. She is a UC Berkeley graduate, specializing in international migration and global poverty in practice, and has been with EBSC since 2022. She's a community organizer and Spanish and French interpreter for clients at the Asylum Office. Originally from Barcelona, she became a migrant rights activist and political representative for her region's immigrants in Brussels, Belgium. Working towards social change is her vocation, and empowering migrants her main mission. Thank you for being here. And lastly, we have Ryan Shapiro, who is a longtime animal rights activist and direct action activist, including being one of the 2 defendants in the first prosecution of an open rescue in US history at Hudson Valley Foie Gras 2003. Ryan is also the executive director of the National Security Transparency nonprofit Property of the People, which among other things exposes government targeting animal rights activists and other social justice activists. Ryan holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In federal court, the FBI declared Ryan's PhD research itself to be a threat to national security. Incredible panelists. I feel like so energized just reading your all bios. So my first question is for Nida. What are some specific tactics of repression that the Palestine liberation movement has experienced in recent years, recent times, and how do you see these connecting to longer historical patterns beyond just the Trump years?
Hello, do you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much, Priya, for the introduction and the intro into this, and I'm so honored to be sitting here with such an esteemed panel. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for the organizers for putting it together, and for everyone, thank you for being here. You guys are so beautiful. Thank you for the question, and as we know, we have been seeing a huge rise in repression of the Palestinian liberation movement. And not just in Palestine, we see it here in the United States, we see it here in the Bay Area, where the Golden Gate 26, who protested the genocide in Gaza in April 15th of 2024, are still in court fighting these charges. So we see the repression, and it's a different kind of, it's a specific kind of repression now. It's kind of mutilated, where it's a legal, cultural, academic, surveillance, social media. It's on all different levels. But these tactics are not unique to the Palestinian movement. They have historical patterns of state repression, specifically against Black, Indigenous, immigrant communities, leftist movements in the US, and recently, though, they've intensified these targeted ways. And it has several phases, and I'll go through each one. First is the criminalization and legal suppression, right? There's anti-BDS laws happening. Over 35 states have anti-BDS laws. You can get a fine if they find that you're boycotting Israel or weapons industry that profits Israel. There's surveillance and FBI targeting, and this is not new. This has been happening for decades in the United States, post 9/11. There's NGO bans and terror designations. In 2004, they put 7 leaders of the Holy Land Foundation in jail, and 2 of them are still in prison 20 years later. There's also an academic repression as we see it now with our students, right? It's huge. They're criminalizing our children. They've normalized the killing of them in schools, and now they're normalizing the criminalization of them. They told us and they taught us in schools to trust our children, to trust what they had to say. And now when they say stop this genocide, we're criminalizing them. So that's been a huge crackdown, but again, this is not unique. We saw this before. We saw this during the Vietnam era. Yeah. And we saw that the students were right. And we know the students are right now. There's also immigration and visa denials, where Palestinians and pro-Palestinian internationals are being deported because their support for the Palestinian liberation. And again, this is not new. In 1987, the US government tried to deport 7 Palestinians and 1 pro-Palestinian from UCLA in '87. And they fought that case for 20 years. And then a judge in 2007 dismissed it. In 2007, so this is not new. They deported Rasmiya Oda just several years ago. And she was a naturalized US citizen. So these surveillance tactics are not new. They take on, I'm skipping, there's also digital surveillance. And I hope everyone is doing digital security training, making sure you guys having the correct apps on your phones, taking the correct measures to keep yourselves and your organizations safe, because this is one area that they are really investing in. So the repression of the Palestinian liberation movement involves a mix of different types of repression, and we're experiencing it all here at the same time. But this is not, I know you said the Trump era, this is not isolated to the Trump era, right? We know this has been happening quietly for generations in this country, in this government. But this reflects a deeper, more structural plan that's based on colonialism, racial and erasure, and ethnic cleansing. But despite all of this, all the polls that are happening are saying that people are changing their minds, and US public sympathy towards Palestinians, especially throughout our younger generations, is changing. And so that brings us hope that the solidarity continues, the student intifada continues, and we will win.
Thank you, Nida. And yeah, something you said reminded me about a news article that I just saw recently about how corporations like Meta are deploying AI and using algorithms to see who is making supportive posts about Palestine and against Israel, and using that to further criminalize regular citizens who are practicing free speech. So my next question is for you, Ryan. What role does fear-mongering or psychological warfare play? How have you seen it impact people's willingness to act? And can you share how the animal rights movement has been targeted, as well as how this is not new, particularly you as a defendant?
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you, everyone, for. I can also just.
So I think with these microphones, hold them down here very lightly.
Is this on? All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Priya. Just an incredible panel. Fear is central and has long been to the efforts of those opposing social justice. Fear is perhaps the most critical tool that those trying to shut down, whether it be animal liberation efforts or any efforts for social justice, because the reality is there are more of us than there are of them. And so to the extent that brute force isn't going to get them where they want, fear is their #1 tool. Specifically looking at the animal rights movement, and I'm going to try to be concise here. I did write a 600+ page dissertation on the history of oppression against the movement. But so even just looking at the United States and going back, I mean, we think of like this sort of targeting. Are people familiar with the Green Scare? Is the Green Scare? Let's, hands raised, everyone knows what the Green Scare is. All right, most folks, all right, great. So we'll come back to that in a moment, but I'm happy to see that. Even if we go back over 100 years, 1917, World War I, anti-vivisection, so folks opposing animal experimentation, not exactly animal rights activists, but you know, they were opposed by the same people who now oppose the animal rights movement. There was an effort to have the new, 1917 Espionage Act used against anti-vivisectionists for opposing wartime animal experimentation. Literally, the law, like the law used against Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, this odious law was used in 1917 in an effort to try to target anti-vivisectionists from opposing wartime animal experimentation, saying that these activists were, quote, aiding and abetting the enemy during wartime and need to be treated as such, which the penalty was death, or the maximum penalty was death. During World War II, those opposing animal experimentation were alleged to be working for Hitler and only interested in opposing animal experimentation because they wanted to open Nazi-style human concentration camps in the United States. During the early Cold War, the scare quotes research defense community, so the pro-animal experimentation lobby, argued that those who opposed the mandatory surrender of pound animals to research labs, that these people were directly taking their orders from the Soviet Union in a plot to overthrow the United States government. Much of the United States military and government was on board with these messages. These people, these folks got targeted terribly. And as far as the modern animal rights movement is concerned, I mean, in 2003, the FBI publicly designated the animal rights and environmental movements the #1 domestic terror threats in the United States, despite the fact that neither of these movements has ever once physically injured a single person in this country ever. In 2005, some of my closest friends and colleagues, the Shack 7 kids, were convicted under federal animal enterprise terrorism laws for running an anti-animal experimentation website. Federal felony terrorist convictions for running a website critical of animal experimentation. It was an aggressive website, but it's still just a fucking website. And then the following year, because the research defense community, the Animal Agriculture Alliance, the anti-animal rights lobbies, because even the Shack 7 conviction wasn't enough for them, then they passed the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is a piece of federal felony legislation, which expands the previous federal felony animal terrorism statute, which was passed in '92. In 2006, it got expanded to cover a really broad range of activism. The first people prosecuted under the new expanded Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act were prosecuted for writing anti-animal experimentation slogans on the sidewalk in chalk. Federal felony terrorism charges for writing on the sidewalk in chalk. Mercifully, the judge threw out the charges in that case, but many others haven't been so lucky. And this period, the early 2000s, when the FBI really came hard against the movement, this is what we refer to as the Green Scare. Journalist Will Potter coined the term, the disproportionate use of the rhetoric and apparatus of national security to marginalize the animal rights movement as a threat to national security. And it had this deeply chilling impact on the movement. So many people stopped doing what they had been doing because they were terrified of, it's okay, maybe, a year in prison for rescuing animals. Okay, I can, I can handle that. I mean, that's certainly what I was thinking when I was being prosecuted. I was facing felony burglary charges for rescue of ducks from Hudson Valley foie gras in upstate New York under local New York statute. But it had this deeply chilling impact on the movement, and that's one of the reasons that DXE was founded, explicitly to fill this void, the chilling impact that the Green Scare had. And it's as a result of DXE coming into this space, the resurgent animal rights movement, really with DXE leading much of the way, that these same industry groups, the Animal Agriculture Alliance and the FBI, are now coming down so hard against DXE, against ZOE, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about this soon. The organization that I'm the executive director for, Property of the People, along with DXE, we're going to be releasing a bunch of documents in the not too distant future about a whole new set of just outrageous bullshit, Green Scare style targeting of the movement broadly, but DXE in particular.
Wow, it's so interesting just hearing two people, just two of the panelists talk, and you can already start to recognize some of the similar ways that the powers at large use similar tactics to criminalize activists. And yeah, that's, thank you for sharing, Ryan. My next question is for Katie. Yes. It should be on. And the question is, how have activists in the climate justice movement fought back against repression? And what has worked and what hasn't? Do you have examples as to how this has been for Planet Over Profit, the organization that we did?
Testing, cool. That's a great question, and it really is so amazing to be able to follow Nida and Ryan in answering this question. And I will also say that, yeah, this will follow the theme of a lot of what we were saying echoing each other, and a lot of us facing similar strains of repression. I think when thinking about the history of the climate justice movement, it's always faced repression in various forms, right? Like from the Green Scare back in the pre-2000s times to just whenever you have a flank of a movement that is threatening infrastructure that is like really, really important for the state to make money. So okay, we're talking things like pipelines, we're talking things like extraction sites for like precious minerals, things like that. Anytime that you're threatening infrastructure and the ability to create mechanisms for the state to make money and really enforce its dominance on the rest of the world, you're going to be facing repression. And so that has always been a context for the direct action wing of the climate justice movement. So that's not new. I think that something that is new and really exciting in recent years is that the climate justice movement has gotten much clearer in the past few years, and I actually credit a lot of that, the catalyst for a lot of that being like the pro-Palestinian movement. I think the climate justice movement has gotten a lot clearer in recent years about understanding that in order for us to really solve the climate crisis, it is important to understand that the climate crisis is driven by this root logic of colonialism, of imperialism, of extraction, right? Like, it is a logic that says, if there's a logic that allows you to plunder the planet and like destroy the entire planet, countless ecosystems, cause animals to go extinct, and literally ruin a planet's chance for providing life for future generations, that is like the same logic that also allows for you to say that it's okay to support a settler colonial state and displace millions of people. It's the same logic that says yeah, and it's the same logic that says it's okay, right, to enforce like cages for people and put up fences, like arbitrary border lines, and refuse refugees at borders for the sake of like making sure you can keep your manicured, precious like little like golf courses or whatever it is people are so worried about. And so I think the climate justice movement in recent years has gotten a lot clearer about that and has really understood then that if the impetus of the movement, if our imperative, right, to solve the climate crisis is address that root cause and like that root issue, then it also means that we need to be really smart about tackling that root cause in many different forms, even if it doesn't look explicitly tied to climate. So I say all that as a preamble to say that I think a lot of the recent repression that's been facing the climate justice movement is actually a direct result of how involved the climate justice movement has been in the anti-oligarchy, anti-Israel, anti-Elon Musk in particular movement in recent months. And so specifically a lot of climate activists and really prominent climate justice folks have been really involved in the Tesla takedown movement, like all across the United States. And that's because, you know, Elon Musk is probably the most obvious like face of fascism right now in a lot of ways. He and Trumpy Poo, like they're like right up there together. And so Elon has like emerged as this like really huge target for a lot of reasons that I said before. Like he's the face of that like dominant logic that we're really trying to dismantle because that's important for all the causes that we care about. And a lot of the repression that we've been facing has been, I think, in direct response to the fact that, like, not only now is the climate justice movement threatening infrastructure that is important for the economy, but it's also, like, joining forces very explicitly and, like, bottom lining these huge direct actions with, like, all of these other organizations that are, like, anti-Trump, anti-oligarchy, etc. Like, they're seeing that we are not staying in our own little like tree-hugging lane. They're realizing that actually like we're joining forces and getting more like politically like smart in a lot of ways. And so with that, I'm gonna tell two quick stories about some examples of repression that folks have been facing. I think like this has been covered already by my co-panelists, but lots of different forms of repression. I think that the ones that I'm gonna be specifically talking about that have been really concerning climate activists include digital harassment and doxing is a really big thing, and so digital security threats, and then obviously there's also like always going to be a lot of concern about incarceration, jail, lawsuits, etc., NGO status, and 501c3 status being taken away, etc. But when it comes to doxing, I think that has been one of the most prominent threats that climate justice activists have been facing. So one of these stories, I don't know if anyone in this room knows of a person named Valerie Costa of Oil and Gas Action Network and the Troublemakers. Yes, I see some fist bumps. Val is amazing, and is the co-director of an organization called Oil and Gas Action Network, also like leads this direct action group in Seattle called the Troublemakers. And Val is just amazing, and her group, the Troublemakers, when the Tesla takedown actions really started taking off in Seattle, she and her group like stepped up to be one of the groups that was helping to like bottom line these actions, helping to coordinate folks to show up to the Tesla showrooms, and like have these big protests, rallies, etc. But like very much not like the face of the movement or anything like that, right? Like I think anyone who has participated in a Tesla takedown action knows like there's no one leader to it in most cities. Like it's like a very disparate, organic, grassroots movement. But because Val is like a really respected organizer, and because like she is like leading a group that was really involved in a lot of this stuff, she ended up getting singled out on Twitter or X by all people. She got singled out by Elon Musk. And so Elon like very specifically named her, said that she was breaking the law, that she was a criminal, posted a video of her like talking in a podcast interview along with another like activist friend of ours, and essentially sicked his entire follower base on her. And so Val ended up getting literally hundreds of threats like to her life, thousands honestly, people threatening physical harm, people trying to figure out where she lived, Elon Musk threatening that he was going to leverage the full power of the feds essentially to go after her and hunt down her organization, etc. And so that was really, really terrifying. And before I go into like what her response is, I'm gonna parallel that with a similar situation that happened with my organization is called Planet Over Profit. I'm a core member or a core organizer for our Bay Area chapter, but we have a New York chapter, and our fearless national director is named Alice. She's incredible. And very similar to Val, like Planet Over Profit in New York City was helping to organize a lot of these actions, was not at all like the leader of it or anything, they were just a convener. And they ended up organizing a really huge action against the Manhattan showroom that went a little bit crazy because folks like went inside to escalate, and like the cops really didn't like that, and the cops broke a window, it was crazy. And so that blew up on social media. And Elon Musk essentially, again, tweets about it and is like, who is responsible for this? Followers, find out. Yes, like literally sicked his follower base, and then was like, if anyone has more information, I'd love to hear. Laura Loomer. Does anyone know who Laura Loomer is? I was gonna say I'm sorry if you know who she is, and for the rest of you, I'm sorry, because now you're gonna know, because I'm gonna tell you. She is crazy, she's crazy. She is a far right-wing conspiracy theorist. She's one of the people who actually peddled, I think she got famous because of her like 9/11 conspiracy theories. She actually became famous in part for helping to popularize the idea that Barack Hussein Obama is like a Muslim who's not actually like American. She was like that person. So she's crazy, and she basically doxed Alice. Like she found out that Planet Over Profit was a key stakeholder in these protests, found out that Alice was the leader, wrote like an entire tweet just like exposing her, included a video clip of her speaking so everyone had the chance to see her face, and then explicitly told folks she is a Chinese national, which is not true. But she did that because she knew that she is Chinese, she's not a Chinese national, but she did that because she knew that in this environment, right, like that would cause folks to call for things like deportation, for ICE to come after her and to detain her, and that's exactly what happened. Alice also faced literally thousands of threats, folks calling for deportation. Her photos, her personal information were cross-posted all over the internet to all of these like pro-Trump fan accounts. It was really horrible. And so I say that to say that that is the political climate that we're living in, where a lot of our leaders, folks who are a lot of like the leaders of our state, right? Folks who have the ability to command millions and millions of people, have influence over millions of people, are literally ad hoc, just sending their fan bases after normal civilians. There is no trial involved here, like there is no judge, there's no jury, there's no due process. They're able to just, of their own accord, send millions of people after individuals who they deem as being threats to the state. And so that is the context we're in right now. And I think it would have been really understandable if Val or Alice had responded to this by being like, you know what, we're gonna go undercover for a little while, right? Or we're gonna go underground for a while. We're gonna be quiet, we're gonna turn off our social media, we're gonna go underground, and we're just gonna hunker down and protect ourselves. And that would have made a lot of sense, but it's not at all what they did. Instead, what Val decided to do was use this platform that has inadvertently been given to her to post all of these op-eds on like The Guardian, NPR, Seattle Times, etc., and basically like use this platform and all this national recognition she was getting to make this case in defense of direct action and make this case in defense of protest and the First Amendment, and to really spotlight how by sticking his followers on her, Elon Musk was being very anti-democratic, basically, and trying to silence free speech and her speech in particular. Alice, literally the week after all this happened, was like, okay, cool, in that case, I'm gonna organize a 75,000 person march in New York City that is about how climate justice and immigrant rights are one struggle, one fight. And literally turned out thousands and thousands of people onto the street. They continue to escalate against Tesla. We also here in the Bay Area, someone who is in this crowd, and I'm not sure if they're gonna feel comfortable with me IDing them, so I will not say their name, but someone in this room and I were part of the first Tesla takedown action that we're aware of on the West Coast, where folks went into the building and actually shut down business and all operations inside of a store for a good chunk of their business day. So I say that to say that I think that in the face of repression, it is actually really, really important not to do their work for them, like not to silence ourselves, because that is actually doing the work for them, even though it's really scary. And I think that by actually seizing moments of being called out, having the spotlight put on you by doing things like writing op-eds, or by being like, you know what, okay, you've labeled me as an enemy, that means something I'm doing is working. Something that I'm doing is actually a threat to you and a threat to your power. I think those are our winning tactics right now when it comes to fighting repression. And so I applaud everyone in this room because I know you're all involved in those same fights too. So I will end this.
Thank you so much, Katie. Wow, that was so much you said. Such incredible stories of resilience and resistance, and I love what you said about how, no, we're not gonna stay in our own tree-hugging place. And my next question is for Marisa. Can you share a moment when your movement overcame an obstacle that felt impossible at the time? And can you share more particularly about challenges of being an immigrant fighting for immigrant rights?
Hi, okay, so the story goes back quite a few years, right? Migration has always existed, and immigrants are the perfect other. And so they're usually the scapegoats for so many problems that the structures in power will use and use them as scapegoats, right? So immigrants are going through a very difficult moment now, but they've always had these issues, right? Here in the US, the sanctuary movement started in the 80s. Actually, the first sanctuary action was in the 70s with people that were conscripted, and citizens decided to hide this young man that did not want to go to Vietnam and declared Berkeley a sanctuary city, and that's how it started. But in the 80s, when we had a huge influx of Central American immigrants that were coming from the civil wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, everybody knew how bad that was, and still the official narrative was that they were economic migrants, right? And what was happening at that time was, again, the fear tactics that you said. It's just, you know, the most critical control tool, right? And they use it to control their enemies, but also their supporters, right? And so what happened back then was that they were starting to say, you know, these people are invading us, they want to reconquer the US, and the fear narrative is always useful. So what happened then? People decided that, you know, that they would not fall for it, and they would defy the law by harboring people, even though it was illegal. And so people took a lot of risk taking in immigrants at that time. But the movement was so overwhelming that it just became impossible for them to keep up. So that's how we need to not succumb to these threats, and we need to stay our course and respond with the right narrative. So if they are creating these false narratives about, how terrible immigrants are, the bad hunger is and all that, you just have to go there and start showing how many immigrants are super decent people, hardworking, and they've been here for years, and they've been members of our community, and everybody knows an immigrant, and they don't respond to this description that the system is giving you, right? So that's one of the ways that it feels impossible, right, to defy the law. But that's what you have to do sometimes when the law is unfair, right? And then with regards to the challenges of being an immigrant fighting for immigrant rights, well, for me personally, it's been a complicated story because I'm from Spain. And I was an economic immigrant in Belgium. So I had to leave my country because we couldn't make ends meet, and became an immigrant elsewhere, and I had to be a domestic worker and everything. So here, I still, I'm a permanent resident, I'm white, and I'm from Spain. So a lot of the immigrants see me as like, no, you're privileged, when I am poor as a rat. But yeah, and it's a whole thing with the stereotypes, the more they spread them, the more harm they do. And it was a challenge for me at the beginning to integrate and say, I'm here to support you because I feel the solidarity. I'm not in direct danger right now. That was, these past few years, now I am. I could be deported. In spite of having had the green card for over 30 years. So, it's tricky sometimes to integrate when you don't belong in a community, but the feeling of solidarity is a very clear feeling. And people see when you are supportive, and people see when you mean what you're doing, and you're committed, and you show up every time, and you dedicate hours and effort, and your heart, you put your heart into it. And so that's one thing that has been very clear this year, is that as soon as we saw what was coming, people started coordinating spontaneously. And organizations that were leading very separate lives, let's say, and very siloed, and each doing practically the same job but not cooperating, all of a sudden, there were this invitations to meetings with a variety of organizations in the area. What can we do to, respond as fast as possible? So I think solidarity and unity are concepts that, are very, very strong and can be felt.
Yeah, I wanted to point out something that you said that was so interesting. While while it is scary to see history repeating itself, and what you said earlier points that out really clearly, it's also, in a way, gives you relief that people have done this before, they fought it, they have resisted, and we can do it again.
Yes, fascism always looks the same, so we can see it coming.
Thank you.
I come from Spain, so.
And we're going to go back to Nida. My next question is, how has your movement managed to keep going in the face of repression? What helps sustain that momentum?
Thank you, Priya. The Palestinian movement is rooted in such a deep and cultural place. Even as a personal story, as a child, around 5 or maybe 6, I went to get bread in Ramallah, and the baker asked me who I was, and I told him I was Nida, and I told him my last name, and he asked me if I was from the Christian or the Muslim family, and I didn't know. So the baker and the people in the bakery started laughing, because you should know this, right? It's a religious country, you should know what religion you're from. And so I went home and I told my dad, and I was crying, and I was like, oh, they laughed at me. And my dad, very sternly, I was 5 or 6, he's 6'4", 6 feet 4 inches, my dad. And very sternly said, if anyone ever asks you that again, you tell them that you're Palestinian. So I remember that, and it's stuck with me, and it's the message that all my people get, that we are Palestinian, and that comes first. So it's rooted in a deep love and a missing of our nation. Also, that love comes in the way of storytelling. Just today, I teach. I'm a graduate professor, and I teach a class about substance abuse, and I was talking about how some indigenous communities chew the coca leaf for pain relief. And I remembered, suddenly, in the middle of my lecture, I remember my grandmother telling me during the Nakba that they would have to go and forage for sage, and in the dark, on the floor, chew the sage leaf for pain relief, for antiseptic. So the stories that were passed on to us is a way that has continued this struggle and our passion for the liberation of our people. And it also comes up in our cultural, in our art, in our embroidery. If you knew the language of embroidery, each dress tells a whole story. It's lived generations. And so we live through those things, those different aspects of our culture. And the organizing aspect is also important. We don't have a central, unfortunately, due to this violent occupation and Zionist project, we don't have a centralized government or leadership. And so our movement is built on grassroots, local movements that, and a lot of you are sitting in this room today, that are not reliant on one leader or one decision or one opinion. As you guys know, we have so many new communities out here, Artists Against Apartheid, anti-Chevron groups for Palestine. So all these communities are popping up and working in their own areas, because we all know that all of our struggles are connected. And this also ties into the global movement, because now, since we are connected, so interconnected on social media and on the internet, we've created a global movement of like-minded humans who stand against this slaughter and want justice. And another thing that is strengthening this movement is the power of the Palestinians in the diaspora. Because we are able to speak up for our people, we are able to fight for our homeland when our people there are not able to do so. And so we have a moral clarity about what we want. And because we don't have a central government or leadership, we understand this moral clarity. We want an end to this violent occupation and a dismantling of Israel. We want a right of return for all Palestinians all over the world. And we want the return of all of historic Palestine.
You're good, keep going.
And most importantly, and I imagine you all know this now, that we have this smooth in us, this resilience, because we know where we belong, and we don't even think it belongs to us. We belong to it. And so we have this steadfastness and resilience that will continue this liberation movement, because we will continue moving and continue fighting, continue pivoting, continue collaborating with other organizations, with other movements. I just met someone from Ecuador yesterday who's fighting against Chevron and the ravaging of their homeland there. And we're so connected. And so I think the way that this movement has been able to continue through all of this devastation and destruction is the international solidarity movement. We are all globally moving together and acting locally, and it's going to shift things. The tide is turning, and Palestine will be free.
Thank you so much for those powerful words, and the only thing I can come up with is these words that came in my mind, which, very simple sentence, but it reminds me of everything you said, which is that separation is an illusion, and we're really starting to see that in so many ways. Yeah, free Palestine. I want to go back to Marisa and ask, what positive things, new leaders, strategies, or solidarity has emerged from the struggle in your movement?
Well, I can give you a very clear example. And unfortunately, I have been here for many years. I've moved back and forth between Europe and the US. But I've never really felt American. It's not my culture. I grew up elsewhere and so on. And one thing that I've resented for a long time is the identity politics, because that has always separated the working class. And it's a tactic like any other. And so when the election happened, immediately, December 18th, we were invited by this group called Friends of La Peña in Berkeley. Yay! And so I didn't know where I was going. This is a cultural center. And I get there, and they're all septuagenarians and all white as they can be. And so my coworker, Manuel, he's from El Salvador, and Manuel saw his sister beheaded and all sorts of things during the war. So he's someone who's been fighting for his people all these years since then. So he's very friendly, and so we sit down at the table. These people are with us, and he tells me, "Estos son más blancos que pa' qué?" They're so white. And I was like, "Shh, I'm white, please," right? So anyway, we start talking to them. These people they came together right after the Chile coup d'etat when Allende was killed. Some of them were there when it happened, and a lot of them were undercover resistance. So some of these people knew each other by their code names, okay? So there was a huge group of people that were helping the resistance in Chile, here in the US. And they have continued to be on solidarity groups. They've been working for Palestine. They've been working for so many things. I didn't know about them. We didn't know about them. But these people have never stopped working for the oppressed. And so when I realized what we had in common, that these people simply had very clear principles and values, I said, yes, let's do whatever we can together, right? So within a month, we had started putting Know Your Rights events together. I was doing the presentations, but they were doing the organizing and the putting it together. And we've trained more than 1,000 people in the last 5 months. And thank you. But Friends of La Peña, in pairs, these old people that have a hard time walking sometimes, have distributed 65,000 red cards. So with the identity politics that have been pushed so much all these years, I just graduated from Cal a year ago, and the first thing they tell you, and the first thing they tell you when you get there is that find your community. What's your identity? Separate all students. Make sure that they all belong to different groups. And I had a huge disappointment when I came to Berkeley because I thought it was a very, leftist university. And yeah. So anyway, but there are, very good people there, with principles and values and doing good things, and we had the encampment and everything. So you never know where that solidarity is going to come from. And I think the most important thing that people need to remember now is how key it is to work for unity across oppressed peoples. It doesn't matter where, Ukrainian, Palestine, which have nothing to do with each other, but anybody that's been oppressed can understand what's happening. And so I think that's the most important thing, that we think globally, act locally, and have a consciousness of being a citizen of the world, which is an anarchist.
Thank you, Marisa. Identity politics seeks to serve those who are trying to divide and conquer us, and not those of us who are trying to create a world of solidarity for everyone, including animals and humans. So yeah, thank you for making that point, because it's definitely a destructive force that I think more and more people are starting to recognize. My next question is for you, Ryan. Movements often feel soiled. What gets in the way of coalition building, and how do we overcome that to get out of that silo? And then